Joshua Part 3, let's look at the problem of violence in this book. In the first unit on Joshua, I started off with application. One application that I did not offer is to identify some category of people as Canaanites that need to be eradicated. I trust, I hope, that you were not surprised by that omission. The New Testament command to love our enemies does not allow for such an application. But then, if it's wrong today, how could it have been right back then? In the second unit, I took you on a walk through the book of Joshua. I accepted the accounts as far as I could at face value, letting them speak for themselves, without questioning their morality or their ethics. Many people today, both firm believers and fierce critics of the Bible, find this impossible. Well, admittedly, Joshua is perhaps the most violent book in the Old Testament. It is not uncommon for critics to use the term genocide to refer to what is described here. Now, I strongly disagree with the use of this term in this context. More on this in a moment. But there is a problem. What do we do with the violence in Joshua? Very different answers have been proposed, ranging from staunch defenders of killing because God has every right to do so, all the way to denying that the relevant passages have any scriptural authority because they contradict the New Testament. I have written extensively on these questions on my blog, Wilrens.org, in 2018, in a series of 5 articles responding to a book by Gregory Boyd, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, published in 2017. I won't repeat all of this, but some of it is pertinent to understand Joshua. Boyd's solution is that all the violence in Joshua, and indeed in the Old Testament, is simply Israel's misunderstanding of who God truly is. In his view, God would never engage in violence, nor would he ever command it. He reinterprets passages that ascribe violence to God as projections of Israel's own understanding unto God, showing us how far God was willing to go, allowing people to misrepresent him based on their sinful and distorting concepts of God and justice. So Boyd does not completely discard such passages, but still finds something of value in them, even though it's not a whole lot. I think, although it's not what Boyd wants, that this is bound to undermine the importance of the Old Testament and to discourage people from spending much time with it. I also think there are better answers. This is the title of Boyd's book, by the way, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, interpreting the Old Testament's violent portraits of God in light of the cross. Here's why I have a problem with this. This is what I think we should not do with Joshua. We should not take moral standards of the 21st century and use them to judge people's behavior well over 3,000 years ago. Or at least, if we do it with great caution and restraint. It was a different world. We should first understand it and then perhaps evaluate its behavior. We cannot hold them accountable to standards that did not yet exist, that had not yet been formulated. This is one reason why I believe it's not right to speak of genocide in Joshua. The term genocide did not exist until well into the 20th century. Plus, another reason to abstain from talking about genocide is that the Israelites did not actually execute genocide even by today's standards. Critics of Joshua, including Greg Boyd, tend to grossly exaggerate what actually happened. What did the Israelites do? Well, genocide is a conscious attempt to destroy a people in whole or in part, and this just did not happen. To put this in positive terms, if that's what we should not do, what should we do? Well, first, we must take a good look at the reality of what happened instead of exaggerating it or putting labels on it. And then second, we must also put this text into its context. What did the Israelites think they were doing? And how did this match, or not, what others around them were doing? So first, what was the reality of the conquest? Here are a few things to keep in mind. Virtually every time, both before and after Israel crossed the Jordan, the attack was initiated by others. The exceptions are Jericho and Ai. For instance, when kings Og and Sihon were asked for permission to pass through their territory, they attacked. The relevant texts indicate that not all that much killing took place. Large numbers of Canaanites continued to live in the area under consideration. Clearly, no genocide was perpetrated. This already becomes clear in the book of Joshua itself, when it points out that many Canaanites remained in the land. The beginning of Judges makes it even more explicit. We should also recognize that all the action in Joshua is focused on cities. But not many people lived in cities in those days. Let me show you a photograph. This shows an aerial photo of Megiddo. An average city might have a few thousand inhabitants at the most. It was more like a village. So don't think New York or London. The large majority of the population lived in the countryside. The cities were administrative and military centers. It is where the king and his army resided. Taking out the cities would remove the threat of a competing power structure that could become oppressive. Back to points to keep in mind. Number 4. Nothing suggests the Israelites engaged in a prolonged campaign to exterminate people. Their battles were short. After each battle or series of battles, the Israelites returned to their camp at Gilgal. And then 5, we have seen that it is possible, in spite of denials in the law, to make peace with Israel. We have seen examples of outsiders becoming insiders, Rahab and the Gibeonites. So let's not exaggerate what happened. Next, what is the context of these events? On context, there are 2 subjects I want to address. First, the conceptual world, especially the practice of cherem, a Hebrew word that is difficult to translate. And second, reports from other nations about their campaigns of conquest. Because, and this is something we need to know, we are dealing with a specialized type of literature. One reason why cherem is a difficult word is that it can be applied to rather different categories. Individuals, nations, cities, cattle, objects, even silver and gold. It's often translated as devoted to destruction, at least in the ESV, but that doesn't work for silver and gold. They cannot be destroyed. Other translations include forbidden or placed under a ban. That's a bit more limited. The translation to devote to destruction certainly states more than the term necessarily means. Not everything that is rendered cherem is to be destroyed or killed. At times, it simply seems to mean to devote something. That is certainly true in this verse, Numbers 18 verse 14, which states, "Every devoted thing in Israel shall be yours, every cherem." This is the definition given by John Walton and his son in The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. Cherem is the removal of something from human use. The emphasis is not on the object, but on everyone around the object. No one shall make use of this. Destruction, when it occurs, so Walton and Walton, is a means to an end. The context of cherem, therefore, is cultic. It's part of a worldview that categorized things as clean or unclean, holy or unholy. Conceptually, the Israelites lived in a world completely different from ours. Most of us consider war as something secular, not a religious activity, except for special cases of holy war, which we mostly frown upon. In the ancient Near East, war was never secular. It was an activity in which the gods fully engaged. The rationale for war was entirely different from the rationale of modern warfare. Karl von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian theoretician of war, formulated a famous aphorism or saying. It states, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." Maybe you've heard this quote before. But back then it was different. War was the continuation of religious devotion by other means. Like it or not, and I suspect God did not, there are hints in the Old Testament that imply a negative view of war, such as Isaiah chapter 2. This was the world of Moses and Joshua and David. This was how the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Hittites viewed the world and acted. War was fully integrated with religion and therefore with the conceptual world of holiness and ritual purity, another concept that is difficult for us to grasp. We simply do not understand the world this way, within a matrix of clean and unclean, and then on top of that holy and unholy. It is in this matrix and in the ancient, fully religious outlook on life and war that Cherem has its place. This is about claiming and dedicating the land to God so that He can reside there. This makes it almost impossible for us to comprehend Cherem. We're too far removed from this world. It's part of a larger conceptual framework that was already in place earlier on, perhaps long before the Canaanites came into view. Cherem has a cultic connotation, although it does not simply mean to sacrifice, but neither does it mean to devote to destruction. The earliest appearances of Cherem in narrative reports are interesting. It turns out Israel practiced the form of Cherem that we know from the conquest before Moses had said anything about it, and in cases where God had not commanded it. The Israelites knew this practice quite apart from God's revelation on the way to the Promised Land. The first occurrence is when the king of Arad attacks them. In Numbers 21, Israel vows to place Arad's cities under Cherem if God gives them victory. God had not asked for this, nor did He command it. Also in Numbers 21 we read about Israel's victory over Sihon and Og. There is no reference here to anything like Cherem, the term's not used. It's only later when Moses recounts the events in Deuteronomy that he speaks of this as Cherem. Deuteronomy 2 verse 34 and 3 verse 6, claiming, quote, "We left no survivors." But in this case too, God had not commanded Cherem. There are several passages before Deuteronomy that speak about what Israel is to do when it enters the land. You see them listed here. These passages do not use the term Cherem, but they do include a commandment to destroy. Interestingly, however, what they are to destroy is the Canaanite gods and their altars. The Canaanites themselves are to be driven out. So where is God's command to execute Cherem on the Canaanites? The only direct instruction to do so appears in 2 verses in Deuteronomy. This is the first verse from Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must Cherem. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. When all of Deuteronomy 7 is read, instead of only 1 or 2 verses, we do not get the idea that Moses is urging genocide, but rather radical separation from the Canaanites and their ways. implying that cherem here may not mean or imply to kill and destroy. The stated reason for cherem is that the Israelites are a people holy to the Lord your God. Such a call for separation, no intermarriage, no covenants, makes no sense if the Canaanites are expected to be killed off entirely. The second verse, Deuteronomy 20. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall cherem the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. Notice that it is only in this second passage that the command is ascribed to God. Yes, it includes killing, but it is focused on the cities. Well, here's an interesting fact. We do not find a single instance in the Torah in which God is reported to speak this command directly. And there is only one verse in which Moses states that it is what God commanded. Well, this is more than nothing, but not by much. Still, it's there. How can we explain it? Here is a big part of the answer. With the Bible, we are dealing with an unfolding and progressive revelation. God started to work with humans within their world and on their moral and developmental level. This is called accommodation, sometimes also condescension. God did not reveal everything all at once. Much was left in place. He adjusted his revelation so that people could understand. Consequently, he condoned much that actually falls short of his will or of truth, for instance, slavery and polygamy, and, I'd say, cherem and purity laws. Accommodation also played a role in the sacrificial system. Animals cannot really take away sin, but it is what everyone was doing, so God took it and used it, even if changing its meaning from bribing or feeding the god to something else. We can clearly see this principle at work in the Old Testament law, but also elsewhere in the Old Testament. War was normal. It took a while for some of the prophets to think that maybe it shouldn't be. So this was a brief look at the reality and the conceptual world of the conquest. Another part of the broader context that's relevant is the kind of document Joshua is, and we will look into that next. The Bible never gives us straightforward history. In fact, such a thing does not exist. Every telling of history is selective and is shaped by the underlying worldview and the historian's purpose or point of view. In the Bible, this purpose is theological. Now, don't get me wrong, this does not mean the history is fictional or distorted, but there are very different ways to tell about the exact same events in order to make different points or bring out different lessons or applications or explanations. Think of the four Gospels. Or wait till you study and compare Kings and Chronicles, two books that cover much of the same ground but do it very differently. It is possible to frame the story of Joshua in a very negative way, in which the Israelites are the aggressors, coming in to conquer and take what is not theirs. Sort of the Old Testament version of jihad, or like colonial powers taking the land of Native Americans or black people in South Africa. It's the story of Israel killing in the name of God. But it is also possible to frame the story very differently. Here's a group of refugees who have just escaped slavery and oppression in Egypt. They are looking for a place to settle. There's plenty of room in Canaan, but its population closes the door and attacks. And when attacked, they fight back. Putting it like this puts a very different spin on the same basic story. So how is the story told in Joshua? When we turn to the actual battle accounts in Joshua, it stands out how repetitive and formulaic they are. Certain phrases keep reappearing. It also stands out how absolute and complete these statements are. Words like all every and none abound. When we turn to the second half of Joshua, there's clear evidence that the Canaanites have not been driven out or destroyed, at least not totally, not by a long shot. A quick scan through Judges chapter 1 reveals even more clearly the continuing presence of the Canaanites in strength. So keep that in mind as we do a scan through the first half of Joshua, looking at the repeated and stereotypical phrases that are being used. Things were not quite as complete as they are presented in this text. Joshua 1, already here at the beginning, we get the phrase, the land that I am giving to them. Okay, here we go. Repeated here, the Lord will give you this land. You will take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. This will be reiterated numerous times in the book. It is God who is giving them the land. Then we come to Rahab. Interestingly, she says the same thing. The Lord has given you the land. The fear of you has fallen upon us. All the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And then verse 11, as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And the spies will repeat this. The Lord has given all the land into our hands. At the end of chapter 2, all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. Then comes crossing the Jordan. The Lord will, without fail, drive out from before you the Canaanites. Takes a little bit here, but then again their hearts melted. Beginning of chapter 5. Chapter 6, God says, I have given Jericho into your hand. Now it's a bit more specific than just the land. Cherem, devoted to destruction, or better placed under a ban. This is a frequently repeated term in the book. Here's what they did with Jericho. They cherem all in the city. They burned the city. Then 7, we get that interruption with Achan, who took some of the cherem. Now it's the heart of the people who melted with fear, not of the Canaanites, but of the Israelites. And then once this is taken care of, the cherem is removed from Israel, we're back on track. God says, I've given into your hand the king of Ai. And so they go. In the battle, not a man was left in Ai or Bethel who did not go out after Israel. God says, I will give it into your hand. And then they struck them down until there was left none that survived or escaped. Once they've finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness, then all of them to the very last, then they returned to Ai and struck it down with the edge of the sword. All cherem. Very absolute. Okay, then we move on. We get the Gibeonites, campaign in the south. The kings gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. Well, that's not. That's a bit of an overstatement, considering the continuation of the story. Chapter 10. Again, cherem and fear. But here, now it gets really interesting. Once the battle really gets going in chapter 10 and 11, the Lord threw them into a panic. They struck them with a great blow. The Lord threw down large stones from heaven. The Lord fought for Israel. The Lord has given them into your hand. They struck them with a great blow until they were wiped out. And yet at the same time, the remnant that remained of them entered into the fortified cities. Then here Joshua captured Makkedah, struck it. Cherem, every person, he left none remaining. This will repeat itself in city after city with some variation. Libnah, verse 30, the Lord gave it also and its king into the hand of Israel. He struck it, every person in it, he left none remaining. Then Lachish, verse 32, captured it, struck it, every person. Then Gezer, verse 33, he struck it, left none remaining. Verse 35, Eglon, they captured it, struck it. Cherem, every person, as with Lachish, verse 37, Hebron, captured it, struck it, every person in it, left none remaining. Verse 39, Deber, similar, captured it, struck it, every person, left none remaining. Sorry. Just as he had done to Hebron and to Libnah, so he did to Deber and its kings. So it goes on. Joshua struck the whole land. He left none remaining. Cherem, all that breathed, Joshua struck them, captured all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord fought for Israel. Chapter 11. Yeah, that's similar language. Just carries on. The Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, verse 8. They struck them until he left none remaining. Then Hazar, there was none left that breathed. He burned Hazar, struck them. Every person, verse 14, they did not leave any who breathed. Verse 15, just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant. So they did, and Joshua took all that land. He captured all their kings, struck them, put them to death. So we come to the end of this first half of the book. Joshua took the whole land. The campaign accounts that we have in the first half of Joshua may therefore be characterized as formulaic, repetitive, stereotypical, and hyperbolic. That we are dealing with, by our standards, rather exuberant hyperbole becomes clear when we pay attention to certain details elsewhere in the book of Joshua, and even more so when we compare the conquest accounts in Joshua and Judges. Now, I'm going to show you a longer quote to read, so I will pause and not speak or be visible to give you some time to read and digest this quote. It's from a book by Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan titled Did God Really Command Genocide? And they quote Kenneth Kitchen, a well-known Egyptologist that's a specialist on Egyptian history and archaeology. Here comes the quote. When we look beyond the formulaic hyperbole, the campaigns seem to have been relatively modest affairs. So how did other nations communicate military successes? Lawson Younger published a thorough study of conquest accounts from the ancient world in 1990. It documents numerous parallels between these accounts and the one we have in Joshua. We're going to look at 3 examples. The first one here shows a stele, a famous one describing a campaign by Pharaoh Meremta or Merneptah in the land of Canaan, or it included Canaan. He reigned in the late 1200s, and the stele famously mentions Israel. That gives us the late date for the Exodus. The very latest that Israel can have entered the land must have been before this date, obviously. And it reads, "The Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Askelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoan is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Huru has become a widow because of Egypt." Second, the Gibal Barkal stele describing a campaign by Pharaoh Thutmose III, who reigned in the mid-1400s. Quote, "The great army of Mitanni, it is overthrown in the twinkling of an eye. It has perished completely as though they never existed." Now Kenneth Kitchen responded to this claim in the late, quote, this is a quote, "In the late 15th century, Thutmose III could boast, 'The numerous army of Mitanni was overthrown within the hour, annihilated totally like those now non-existent,' whereas in fact the forces of Mitanni lived to fight many another day in the 15th and 14th centuries. It is in this frame of reference," so Kitchener, "that the Joshua rhetoric must also be understood." And finally, the Mesha stele, set up by the king of Moab by that name around 840 BC, so quite a bit after Joshua, but still typical of these kinds of accounts. It's rather long, I only quote part of it. "I assaulted the wall and captured it, and killed all the warriors of the city for the well-pleasing of Chemosh and Moab, and I removed from it all the spoil and offered it before Chemosh in Kiriath. And Chemosh said to me, 'Go take Nebo against Israel.' And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the break of day till noon, and took it. And I killed in all 7,000 men, but I did not kill the women and maidens, for I devoted them to Ashtar Chemosh." Now, there are parallels to night campaigns and other strategies used by Joshua here in other conquest or battle accounts as well. Parallels to miraculous events. Joshua 10 speaks of hailstones. Other accounts speak of hail as well, or even a meteor. So to summarize Lawson Younger, quote, again from Copen and Flanagan's book, Younger's study shows quite conclusively that Joshua is written in accord with the rhetoric and conventions of ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts. Such accounts narrate history in a highly rhetorical, stereotyped, figurative fashion and utilize substantial hyperbole, narrating battles in terms of total annihilation of everyone. To read these accounts as though the author were literally affirming that total extermination had taken place is simply to misread them. Or, in the words of Kitchen again, this was how such military reports were customarily written. Younger's study convincingly proves that these accounts were not intended as straightforward and factual historical records. The accounts are ruled by conventions that were familiar to the readers. Different from us, they would not have misunderstood these texts. It's not unlike saying, after a game, "We slaughtered the other team." Such a statement is not untrue because everyone knows how it is to be understood.